The Emancipation Proclamation, 1863. The year turned from autumn to winter with a hush that settled on streets and farms alike. Frost drew pale lace on window panes. In army camps, thin smoke rose from cook fires as men warmed hands over tin cups. The war had gone on longer than anyone had guessed. Families measured time by letters and by the names printed in newspapers. Inside the White House, a tall, tired president weighed a question that reached into every tent and kitchen: what should be done about the millions of men, women, and children held in slavery within the states that were fighting the Union? When the war began in 1861, leaders on each side named simple goals. The Union said it fought to save the nation. The Confederacy said it fought to become a nation of its own. Beneath those words stood the reality of slavery. Cotton, rice, and sugar were grown by enslaved hands. Roads, forts, and trenches in the South were built in part by enslaved labor. From the first weeks of the conflict, enslaved people watched blue uniforms draw near and made choices that took great courage. Some slipped out at night and walked for miles to reach Union lines. Some arrived at forts with children in their arms and hope that could not be shaken. They came not as cargo but as people seeking safety and a future. Policy at first was uncertain. One commander might order people returned to their enslavers; another, unsure of the law, might hesitate. Then, in May 1861 at Fort Monroe in Virginia, General Benjamin Butler made a practical decision. He said that people escaping from those in rebellion would not be returned, because their labor had been used to build enemy defenses. He called them contraband of war, meaning their labor could no longer be claimed by the Confederacy. The decision spread by rumor and by newspaper. More came. Congress followed with laws that weakened slavery where the war was hottest, saying that those enslaved by enemies of the United States could not be forced back into bondage. President Abraham Lincoln moved carefully. He hated slavery and had said so long before the war, but he also had to keep a fragile coalition together. Border states, Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware, still allowed slavery but had not seceded. Lincoln feared that a sweeping order could push them into the Confederacy. He also knew the Constitution limited federal power over slavery where states remained at peace. As he studied reports from the front and letters from citizens, he looked for a path that was both right and lawful. By the summer of 1862, the war had grown fierce and costly. Battles in Virginia, Tennessee, and along the Mississippi taught the country how hard victory would be. Casualty lists rose, and with them a sense that the old arrangements could not stand. Advisers urged the president to strike at slavery directly and to draw strength from the people the Confederacy held in chains. Lincoln drafted a proclamation that would use his powers as commander-in-chief to declare freedom in areas still in rebellion. He read the draft to his cabinet. Some agreed at once. Others said to wait for a battlefield success, so the order would not appear to be a move of desperation. In September 1862, the Union Army halted a Confederate advance at a Maryland town called Sharpsburg, near Antietam Creek. The day was terrible beyond measure, but when the smoke cleared, the Confederate Army had withdrawn. Lincoln judged the moment enough. On September 22 he issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It gave notice that on January 1, 1863, all persons held as slaves in any state or part of a state then in rebellion would be thenceforward, and forever free. The document also announced that the Army and Navy would recognize that freedom, and it invited those enslaved to make no violence unless in necessary self-defense. It warned that if the rebellion ended before January 1, the order would not take effect. The clock began to tick. Important stepping stones had already been laid before the final order. In April 1862, Congress abolished slavery in the District of Columbia, paying compensation to former enslavers and providing modest help to newly freed families. That law showed that the national government could end slavery where its authority was complete. In the same season, Congress prohibited slavery in the Western Territories, drawing a bright line for future states. In July, the Second Confiscation Act declared that people enslaved by those aiding the rebellion were forever free, and the Militia Act authorized the enlistment of black men in the service of the United States. Lincoln urged the loyal border states to adopt gradual, compensated emancipation. Their leaders declined. He also considered colonization schemes, then set them aside as impractical and unjust in the face of clear counsel from black Americans. By late 1862, legal groundwork and hard experience had converged. The way forward was freedom, backed by law and enforced by the Army. The weeks between September and January were filled with argument and prayer. Some Northerners feared the proclamation would lengthen the war or send freed people north to compete for jobs. Others said the step was overdue and that the Union could not be saved unless slavery ended with it. Abolitionists, who had worked for years to end slavery, urged the president to stand firm. Black leaders met with Lincoln, pressed the case for military service, and offered simple truth. People would fight for their own freedom and for the nation that promised it. New Year's Eve 1862 arrived cold and watchful. In churches across the North and in Union-occupied towns in the South, people gathered for watch night services. They sang, prayed, and waited through the final hours. In Washington, the White House opened for a public reception on January 1st. The president shook hands for hours until his right arm trembled. After the reception, he returned to his office to sign the final text. He looked at his name on the page and said later that if he had signed with a shaking hand, some might say he had signed in doubt. So he steadied himself and wrote plainly, Abraham Lincoln. The final Emancipation Proclamation declared that all persons held as slaves in rebellious areas were free. It named the states and specific counties and parishes still in rebellion. It exempted places already under Union control and did not apply to the loyal border states. It announced that the government would recognize and maintain the freedom so declared and that black men would be received into the armed services of the United States. In plain words, it tied the nation's military power to a new purpose, union with freedom. Freedom did not arrive everywhere at once. The proclamation could only take root where Union forces could enforce it. Yet wherever blue uniforms appeared, the order gained voice. Officers read it aloud on courthouse steps. Chaplains read it in fields to crowds who stood with heads raised. Sailors read it from gunboat decks to people gathered on riverbanks. On plantations near navigable waters, families left fields and walked toward the sound of oars. In towns where Union troops set up headquarters, people lined up for wages, rations, and papers that marked a new status. The U.S. Army and Navy became, in practice, carriers of freedom. Some of the earliest changes took place along the southern coast. In the Sea Islands of South Carolina and Georgia, Union forces had occupied land since 1861. Many white planters had fled, leaving behind cotton fields and the communities that had labored there. Northern aid groups and the Army organized what became known as the Port Royal Experiment. Freed families worked for wages, governed local matters, and started schools. Teachers arrived with slates and primers. Children and adults learned letters and numbers together. Gardens were planted, cabins repaired, and meetings held to set rules and resolve quarrels. The work was not perfect, but it was proof that free labor and self-government could grow in soil once claimed by slavery. The proclamation opened the door to military service, and people stepped through it. Recruiting officers set up tables in occupied towns. Word spread across fields and through kitchens. Men who had been forced to work without pay now chose to work for a cause. Regiments formed, some from northern states, some from the South itself. They drilled in new uniforms and shouldered muskets. In time, nearly 200,000 black soldiers and sailors served the United States. They guarded railroads and rivers, built forts, and stood in line of battle. The 54th Massachusetts became famous for its courage at the walls of a sea fort. Thousands of others served with equal courage in places few remember, steadying the army with discipline and skill. Not all changes were smooth. Life in contraband camps and newly freed towns could be hard. Crowding, sickness, and short supplies tested everyone. The Army's main purpose was still to fight the war, not to run cities. Aid societies helped fill gaps. Women from the North came as nurses and teachers. Ministers came to preach, baptize, and help families record marriages. Freed men and women formed mutual aid groups, shared food, and watched one another's children while parents worked for wages. With every paycheck and every signed contract, a new habit took root: labor by agreement, not by force. In the Confederacy, reactions ranged from anger to denial. Slaveholders called the proclamation illegal and insisted that nothing had changed. But the changes were visible in empty quarters and quieter fields. Each person who left took away labor the Confederacy had counted on. Southern officers reported shortages of workers to build forts and move supplies. The proclamation worked not only as a moral statement but also as a tool of war. It pulled at the seams of the Confederacy's economy and strengthened the Union's hand. The policy also changed how foreign nations viewed the war. In Britain and France, where mills and merchants had once considered recognizing the Confederacy, public support shifted toward the Union. Many people did not want their countries to side with a government fighting to preserve slavery, especially after the Union had made ending slavery a central aim. The chance of foreign recognition for the Confederacy faded. The war would be decided within the United States. Some northern cities struggled with the changes at first. In the summer of 1863, anger over the draft in New York City exploded into riots that turned violent against black residents. Soldiers had to restore order. The scenes shocked many and reminded the country that ending slavery would require not only laws but also sustained work of the heart. In time, as black regiments fought with distinction and as families in the North came to know black neighbors who had fled the South, more minds changed. In letters and speeches, President Lincoln spoke about the proclamation with a quiet certainty. He called it the central act of his administration and of his life. Yet he also knew that a wartime order might be questioned when peace returned. He therefore urged Congress to pass a constitutional amendment to abolish slavery everywhere. The 13th Amendment moved slowly at first, then gathered votes. By December 1865 it was ratified, and slavery ended under the Constitution. The proclamation had opened the door, the amendment fastened it open. Even with the amendment, the work of freedom continued. What did freedom mean in daily life? It meant being paid for labor, choosing where to live, marrying with legal recognition, learning to read without fear, testifying in court, and traveling without a pass. Freed people pursued these rights in thousands of small steps. They placed notices in newspapers looking for lost relatives. They formed churches that became centers of community and learning. They saved to buy land. They stood in lines to register their names as citizens and to seek protection under new laws. Progress was not steady everywhere, but it was real, and it was theirs. It is helpful to picture the proclamation not as a single moment but as many simple scenes. A Union sergeant stands on the steps of a courthouse in a small southern town and reads the words while townspeople and freed families listen. A mother who had hidden a marriage ring in a hem brings it out and has her union recorded by a chaplain. A child writes a first name on a slate under a shade tree while a teacher smiles and nods. A black soldier writes to his wife, tucking a few dollars into the letter, and tells her where to meet him when the war is over. In each scene, the country becomes a little different and a little more itself. Some parts of the South did not hear or accept the news for a long time. On the broad distances of Texas, for example, the old system lingered until Union troops arrived in strength. On June 19, 1865, a Union general in Galveston announced that enslaved people there were free under the proclamation. The day later came to be called Juneteenth. Families gathered to read the order, to pray, to cook, and to share stories. Year after year they met to mark that the promise of January 1st had finally reached the Gulf. The proclamation also changed the spirit of the Union Army. Soldiers who had enlisted simply to save the nation found themselves part of a cause larger than they had first imagined. Some wrote home that they now saw the war's purpose more clearly. Others struggled and had to be convinced. Officers issued orders against the mistreatment of freed people and warned that the Army would protect them. The Army did not always succeed. But over time, more units understood that their marching opened space for new lives to begin. Nurses and doctors played quiet roles in the change. In hospitals near the front and in city wards, they treated soldiers of every background. Black nurses tended black regiments and freed families in contraband camps. White nurses learned from them and with them. When a patient asked to hear the words of the proclamation, someone fetched a printed sheet or repeated as much as they could remember. A sentence could steady a heartbeat. A promise could ease pain for a while. Teachers came with trunks of books and with patience. They set up classrooms in praise houses and in empty warehouses, on porches and under trees. Adults sat beside children and learned the alphabet, then sentences, then numbers. They learned to sign their names to contracts. They learned to read Bible verses or newspaper notices seeking relatives. Every letter formed was a small act of independence. The chalk squeaked, the slate clicked, and a new habit took root, writing one's own future. Even as new beginnings formed, the war pressed on. The proclamation did not shorten all the roads of the conflict, but it changed their direction. Black regiments fought at places like Port Hudson and Olustee, at Milliken's Bend and New Market Heights. They built fortifications and held them. They marched in reviews that changed the sight of city streets. Their presence asked the country to expand its idea of who belonged. When pay was unequal, they protested until Congress corrected the rate. When doubt was voiced, they answered with steady service. After the fighting ended in 1865, the question became how to turn wartime freedom into peacetime rights. The Freedmen's Bureau was established to help with food, contracts, schools, and the reunification of families. Bureau agents, often overworked and under threat, wrote labor agreements and listened to complaints. Churches and local groups did their part. So did the veterans of black regiments, who returned with uniforms, with pride, and with a belief that the country must honor their service with full citizenship. In the North, people kept printed broadsides of the proclamation in frames on parlor walls. In the South, families saved hand-copied versions wrapped in cloth. Preachers read the text on anniversaries. Children asked what the words meant and were told, "It means we are free, and we must be wise." The document's language was plain, but the feelings around it were deep. It became a touchstone for those who sought justice in later years. Its sentences were quoted in pulpits, in meeting halls, and on courthouse steps when citizens asked the nation to keep its word. Because the proclamation left slavery untouched in loyal states and exempted some occupied areas, critics sometimes called it limited. That is true as law on the day it was signed. But as cause and signal, it was wide. It announced that the United States would use its strength to undo slavery where it fought. It said that black men would fight for the Union and be welcomed in its ranks. It set a direction that could be carried to its end by the amendment that came later. In this way, a document born of war helped shape a broader peace. Think of one more scene, set in the winter of 1863. A small crowd gathers outside a courthouse in a southern town held by Union troops. An officer unfolds a sheet of paper and begins to read. Some people stand with arms crossed, doubtful. Others hold hands, eyes wet. Behind them, children climb onto a fence to see better. As the officer reads, a woman closes her eyes. She whispers a name, her own last name, chosen for herself. When the reading ends, there is no trumpet. There is only a deep breath, and then another, and then the quiet beginning of a different day. Let the story slow to rest. Picture the president at his desk, the lamp burning low, the page set square before him. Outside, the city is quiet. Far away, in fields and on riverbanks, people make plans they could not make the year before. A man agrees to wages for the first time. A mother tells a child that school will start soon. A soldier writes home that the unit has taken on new recruits, men who will fight under the same flag. The proclamation does not end struggle. It does something else, it clears a path. People step onto it with care, carrying one another as they go. The words traveled by rail and river, by saddle and on foot. They were carried in pockets, folded into Bibles, pinned inside coats. They were copied on scraps and memorized. They were spoken around fires at night and in fields at noon. Those words said that freedom had a date and a voice, and that the voice belonged not only to leaders but also to the people who would live it. That is why the document still matters. It reminds us that the law can open a door, that courage can hold it open, and that ordinary hands can build a life on the far side of the threshold. Now, as you rest, let small sounds fade in your mind, the scratch of a pen, the soft rustle of paper, the slow turning of a key in a lock that has been closed too long, the first footsteps through an open doorway. The Emancipation Proclamation was signed in a quiet room, but its echoes are gentle and steady still. Breathe with them. Let the light of that winter morning spread, first across a desk, then across a city, then over rivers and fields, until it reaches every place where a person stands and says, with calm conviction, I am free.